Hi everyone and welcome to the Toshiba webinar about print optimization. This webinar will be going for about 40 minutes and specifically we're looking at how to optimize print through a barcode or label printer provided by Toshiba. In this webinar we'll be covering off 5 different sections to look at the what, how and why these types of problems can occur and how to resolve them. At the end of this webinar, you should have a sound understanding of what creates a bad print or causes your machine to behave in that particular way, what tips and tricks there are to resolve print issues, which also looks at the different components of the printing process, different methodologies of printing. Now today we'll be specifically looking at thermal printing as this is what we specialize in. For laser or inkjet methodologies, this will be a different webinar, not provided by Toshiba. We'll also be looking at how to resolve ribbon issues if you are using thermal transfer or the ink consumables in your printing process. And finally, the benefits of using software when it comes to optimizing print and preventing print issues. So before we get started, just a very quick introduction about the presenter, myself. My name is Kate Lusk and I work for Toshiba Australia from Sydney head office. I've been the Auto ID channel manager here for a couple of years, but I've got over 10 years experience in the industry, specifically from a technical perspective with consumables, as I used to work for a ribbon manufacturer prior to this current role. Now, in my day-to-day life and work function, I help customers to get over issues within their printing processes, including things like missing inventory because of misscans or labels that are coming off, how to improve their supply chain visibility, reduce costs on labeling processes, or even looking at how you can automate further and remove archaic systems within the organization. Now, at the end of this presentation, there will be contact information for Toshiba Australia. However, if you'd like to connect with me personally, please feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. You'll find me under hashtag BarcodeKate. All right, so let's get into it. So the first section that we'll be going through is what a bad print is, why it happens, and what the results can mean for your business. So really understanding why it's important for us to actually fix these types of problems. So a bad print can take many shapes and forms. It really depends on the information, the variable information, or even static information on your labels. And it's not limited just to the barcode. This is commonly what's thought of when we talk about a bad print. But it can also be the text on your label. Maybe it's faint or a bit blurry. It could have unrefined edges. It could have letters that are missing. It could be printed in the incorrect position on your label. So there's a whole variety of types of problems you can experience when it comes to labeling. Now, the good news is, whilst there's a large amount of different types of print problems you can experience, it's really very easy to fix them. And they typically relate to 3 or 4 main components within the printing process that we'll be looking at today. Before we look at what those processes are, it's important to understand why we need to fix them, because this can often be a hidden cost in your business when you're experiencing bad print. It's not an immediately obvious cost to the company, but you can actually have quite expensive problems occurring, like rejected shipments or customers being unable to recall products. You're doing extra handling of things. You're having to get people to intervene. Let's say, for example, that your label printer is printing labels and every third one is not in the correct position. So someone's there having to remove these labels, etc. It can end up being quite a costly event when you don't fix these types of problems. And over time, the time invested when you don't fix it ends up being quite significant. So that's why it's important that we look at how to fix these things so we can get to the ideal state where we're not spending time fixing hardware problems and print problems. The other thing is as well, often the cost of a bad print isn't necessarily thought about because it doesn't directly impact your business, but there's cost to consumers. For example, let's say that you're in a medical industry. If the information you've printed rubs off the label or it's not legible or can't scan, that could have serious health implications for the consumer. In addition, it can give you a bad rap if your label doesn't look very presentable or it's missing key information for the consumer. That can cause a disconnect between the consumer and your brand. So even from a marketing perspective, it's quite important that the label print is of a high quality. And of course, there's the physical waste and physical expense of the labels themselves that you aren't able to use if you're having these kinds of problems. So all in all, there's a lot of different costs, which is why we need to look at fixing it. And today, I'm going to show you how. So optimizing your print simply means adjusting settings either in the hardware or with your labels or with your consumable ribbons that you're using to solve the bad print problems that you're having. That's all that it means. So in order to understand how to optimize your print, we need to understand what the key elements of your printer actually are, because these play a very important role in ensuring you have a high quality print. So a thermal printer, as the name implies, uses heat to create an image. And you can see here from this diagram the basic flow of any print in a label printer. It receives a job, which has predefined settings or parameters that the user sets. This file has instructions for the thermal printer on how much heat to generate to either transfer an image or burn an image, depending on the print methodology that you're using, which we'll be looking at in the next section. So creating heat is central to the whole process of a thermal printer, and that's why when we're looking at how to improve bad print, we need to understand the energy settings of your device. Now, energy settings relates to how much heat the printer needs to create based on the information it receives from your file. We're also going to be looking at the different kinds of labels that are available and whether some of these labels have particular nuances where they need a different type of setting. For example, a paper label versus a plastic label, and how that can ultimately affect the finished product. Finally, if it's applicable to your business, we're going to be looking at ribbons, what the different types are, how they work, what are the common problems you can have with ribbons, and the ways to resolve those problems. So what I find is typically when someone is trying to resolve a bad print problem, they often start with the finished output. So they've run their job through the printer, it's generated the print, and the quality of the print is poor. So the natural assumption is that the problem is coming from the printing process, which normally implies that there's a problem in the consumer minds with the ribbons or the labels. But this is a common mistake, and we shouldn't start here when we're looking at bad print and how to fix it. In fact, we should be looking at the first part, the information in the file settings. What have we told the printer to do? Now, the reason that this section is normally overlooked is because commonly the instructions on how to do this are not provided to people, or it's not immediately available, which is why I've included it in this webinar today. So I mentioned before that creating heat is central to the overall printing process of a thermal printer. And the printer receives that information from the file settings. But what does it actually do to the printer? So when a thermal printer receives the file, it then sends that parameter information for processing. And a part within your machine, which is called a print head, is what actually physically heats up and either heats the ink on a roll of ribbon that you can see in this diagram here and transfers that ink, or it simply burns an image in the label, depending on what you're using. So if we don't have enough heat here, or on the opposite to that, too much heat here, it vastly changes the print output that you're going to receive. So this is where we're going to start. The good news is it's really easy to fix this type of problem. I know it sounds complicated, but it's actually very, very straightforward. So in your printers, devices and printers in your control panel, or if you're using a label program, simply go to the print dialog section. You'll see there's printing preferences. Now, we're going to be looking at two different things here, but they're both related and important for us to check. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at here when we're looking about increasing or decreasing the energy settings in the driver, first of all, is that we're even telling your printer that it needs to heat up for a ribbon or not, that it has the right sensor information, and then finally what the energy settings need to be. So in the stock tab, what we're primarily interested in is this section here, media settings. So first of all, print method, normally it's default to direct thermal. We want to make sure that it's the correct print method that you're using. Now, if you're unsure of the print methodology that you have, stay tuned for the next section and that should answer any questions. But basically, if you're using a roll of ink, you need to use thermal transfer. And that's what tells the machine, yes, I have a ribbon and I need to heat this ribbon up. We also then need to check the sensor. There's 4 different sensor types available in the driver, and by default, it's disabled to none. So what will happen is you might find that you're printing and the position of your print is varying across the labels. And this can be a very frustrating problem because you refeed the labels, you put it in the correct position, and then only 2 labels later it's printing in the wrong spot. If that sounds like a problem that you're experiencing, it's almost guaranteed to be that the sensor setting is not correct. So if it's disabled to none, the printer is not using a sensor. It's not able to detect the length of your label and where it should print. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we have the correct sensor as well. So transmissive is for when you have labels that have a gap between them and no black mark on the backing paper. So essentially the sensor is looking for the gap between the labels. Reflective is the next option, and this sensor is used when you have black marks on the back of your labels, and the sensor is looking for that black mark. Finally, you have a continuous sensor. This is when there are no gaps in your labels at all, so it's one continuous label. These aren't that common. Most commonly, you'll use transmissive or reflective sensors. So once you've done that, you won't have any print alignment issues, and the result that you see should be as what you see on your screens. Okay, so once we've done that, we need to go into the Options tab in the same dialog box, and we need to check the box that says Set under Print Density Adjustment. This is where we control the energy settings for your printer. And you'll note here that there's 2 different sections, direct thermal or thermal transfer. Now, the number that you input here will depend on a few different things. It will depend on the print methodology you're using, the resolution that you're using, the type of ribbon, if you're using a ribbon that you have, as well as the types of labels that you're using and speed. So there's a couple of different things to think about here. Generally speaking, 0 is neutral. The range in which you can operate between will depend on the model of printer that you have. But for example, if we were looking at an industrial Toshiba label printer, it would be from -20 to +20 as an example, or -10 to +10 depending on which configuration you have. So typically speaking, if we're wanting to get more transfer of an image or a darker image, we'll use a higher heat. if we're wanting to get nice sharper edges, we might find that backing the heat off a bit helps with that. So it's really just a matter of trial and error. There's no set rule. It's just a matter of seeing where you can get the best print at the lowest temperature. You always want to try to use the lowest temperature possible before the print is compromised, and that's because it has benefits for your printer, which we'll be discussing momentarily. So a healthy print head is really important to making sure that your print outcome is how you want it to be. If you're getting white lines appearing through your print, like we saw in the bad print examples, that's because it's time to replace your print head. Generally speaking, print heads have a lifespan that they're recommended to, and you should be able to get this information from your partner. The other way that you can improve the life of your print head is by managing the energy settings. So if you are constantly running your print head at a very high heat, it uses more energy and ultimately burns your print head out faster. So it is in your interest to run it at a lower temperature if you can. Now, a common mistake that I find is customers, especially when they're using ribbons, they'll run the print head a lot hotter because it gives a blacker print. But you don't actually need to do this. Instead, you should ask your provider for a blacker ribbon. And that way you're not having to overcompensate with the print head settings, which will burn your print head out faster and cost you more money in the long run. There are lots of different types of black available, and the actual technical term for it is called a Macbeth rating or a Macbeth density rating. So some ribbons are a very, very true black, whereas others are more of a charcoal grey. And this type of information is commonly known with ribbon providers, so you should be able to get some information from your partners about this. Now, the other quick and easy way to improve your print is to use the on-file conditional printing with a label program. So we're going to be looking at this a little bit later, but in essence, what I'm talking about is storing settings by file so that you're not having to constantly be changing the settings that you have in the driver. And you can see here there's an image on screen, and that's an example of a top-down view of a print head. So that's a consumable part in your machine. It's one of the most valuable parts in your machine that you want to be taken care of appropriately. And for some tips on how to maintain your print head, check out one of the articles on our website. I'll be showing it towards the end of this webinar. Okay, so labels themselves, obviously these are a core part of the printing process. The thing is, there's so many different types of labels. And when I say different types, I mean the base materials, but also the different variations of color that you can have, what types of finish it has. Is it a gloss finish, a matte finish, a semi-gloss finish, etc.? There's a lot of different types available. Now, all of this information is important when you're talking to a partner and looking for a new setup, but also it's important to understand what effect that these things may have on the print output that you want. So, for example, a base material could be paper-based or synthetic-based stock. These require different types of energy settings and typically require different ribbons as well. You might find that the colors also can affect the print quality that you get. Because we're flood coating the top of that label, it makes it harder for ink to transfer to that stock. And finally, things like varnishes and finishes, they just make it a bit more tricky to get the finesse that consumers typically need when they're doing, for example, fine printing. So all of these things are very important to take into consideration. And one of the most important things to remember if you're using a ribbon is that the ribbon and the label have to be correctly paired for the ribbon to transfer properly. And this is a major area where I see errors occurring, and that's what we'll be talking about in section 4 in this webinar. Okay, so I've mentioned now a couple of times about ribbons and direct thermal, and that there can be common mistakes between these different types of print technologies. So before we look at that, it's important to understand the difference between direct thermal and thermal transfer. and which one it is that your business needs or may be currently using. So both thermal transfer and direct thermal are a thermal printing method, but they behave differently in the way that they print and also in the consumable requirements that they require. Sometimes I find that customers have a direct thermal label and the confusion comes from the word thermal being used with thermal transfer as well, and they end up ordering ribbons that don't print properly on the labels. There can be all sorts of problems like that. So it's important to have a base understanding of what print methodology you are using. If you're not sure, your partner should definitely be able to help you with this. So direct thermal itself simply is the printer and a label or a receipt paper. So it's the same type of process that we get when we receive a receipt from a shop. The printer burns an image on the stock. And the way that that image is generated is not with ink or toner, which is a common misunderstanding. It's actually generated because the stock is heat sensitive. So it actually has a chemical reaction to the heat that's generated from the print head to create that black print. Now, it's very important that we use the correct process for the labels that we have. So remember I mentioned there's a lot of different label types, and those labels come in direct thermal configurations and thermal transfer configurations. So if we're printing using a direct thermal printer, we need direct thermal labels. Otherwise, you're going to have a print problem. Now, the other thing is that you can see on this screen here is another part in the device called a platen roller. This is a rubber roller, and its purpose is to create pressure and drive the labels through under the print head. This particular part is really important, but it's often overlooked, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about this later on in the webinar, but it's definitely a part that you should remember to maintain. Okay, so for direct thermal, before I move on to thermal transfer, one of the other things that can lead to a bad print or the perception of a bad print is the pixelation of that print. So understanding the resolution that you require and the size of fonts that you would need to be using is important when you're looking at your label printer, whether you're looking to purchase one or just to simply get a better print from your device. If you're printing fine, small prints or very detailed images, you need a higher resolution machine, and typically you'll find direct thermal devices are available in 200 dpi and 300 dpi. And what that means is that there's more dots per inch, so you get a finer print. Because ultimately what's happening under the print head is we're printing in this pixel format that you can see in the red circle here. So when you use direct thermal, it is literally just burning that specific spot to generate a black image. And so you'll find that between direct thermal and thermal transfer, that direct thermal tends to have this sharper, blockier type of look, whereas thermal transfer tends to be a bit of a finer print. So we'll be looking at that as well. So ribbons themselves, I've mentioned this already a couple of times. So what is a ribbon? In essence, a ribbon is a roll of ink. It's like a toner roll that we used to have in the old fax machines. Ribbons come in 3 different classifications, and this services all of the requirements for any type of printing, whether you're printing on basic paper stocks right through to fabric printing for horse race sashes or things like that. So any type of material can be printed on just about with a ribbon. So out of these 3, it can be very difficult to identify what you need, because a black ribbon, whether it's wax resin or resin, all look identical, but they're actually very different. So high level, we're going to look at the 3 different types. So wax is the most economical option, and in the Australian market, it probably makes up I would say roughly 5 to 10% maximum of all consumer demand in Australia. The reason for that is because it's a short shelf life product. It's suited to be printed on paper stocks and most commonly used in these industries because they're high turnover labels that don't need to last for a long time. So the way that a wax ribbon works, if you imagine a candle, when we heat a candle up and you see that the wax starts to drip down the side of the candle and it shapes to any shape underneath it or around it before it cools and sets, that's how a wax ribbon works. It's normally recommended for very porous paper stocks. If you looked at a porous paper stock under a microscope, you would see that it actually is not flat, it's not smooth. It has dips and valleys in that label. And so the wax ribbon ink fills those dips and valleys, and that's what gives a really nice black print. So it's perfect for bright prints. However, it's not great when you need it to last for a while or where there's going to be heat or friction involved. Because just like a candle, when we reheat the wax, it starts to melt again and starts to reshape. And this is what happens with a wax print on a label. If you start to rub that label or scratch it with your nail, it will start to smudge. So it's an economical option, but only for short shelf life applications. Now, wax resin is by far and away the most popular. Makes up about 75% of all demand in the Australian market. So as the name implies, it's actually a blend product. So it has an element of wax and an element of resin as well. Now, resin is sourced from trees. So if you imagine sap that hardens over time, that's the property of a wax resin ribbon. It has that resin element to enhance preserving your print, stopping it from scuffing or smudging easily. But because it still has that wax element blended in, it's very malleable. So it can print on a lot of different stocks, but has a higher resistance to smudging and scratching. So this particular product is recommended for predominantly paper, but it can be used for synthetics as well, because it does have that enhanced resistance. Now, if you need an indestructible style of ribbon, then you need a pure resin. Now, pure resin is the most expensive ribbon on the market, but it lasts the longest depending on the label that you're using. It can only be used with synthetic stocks, partly because of the way it's constructed, but also we wouldn't recommend to use it with a paper-based stock for the cost of the ribbon versus the cost of the label. It doesn't really make sense. So normally a resin is used for a synthetic label where it needs to last for a long time against harsh environments such as chemicals or outdoor storage, high heat, cook in the bag applications, those kinds of things. So resin itself is very specialized. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different types of chemicals that are out there between the automotive industries or healthcare, pharmaceuticals, these kinds of things. So each resin is specific to a set of chemical resistance. So it's really important that you test resins before you order them, because there's nothing worse than having a print run that has to be rejected because it gets compromised when it comes into contact with a chemical on your site. So it's always, as I say, definitely worth asking your partner for a sample to trial, or asking them if they're able to do their own tests on your behalf. Now, resin ribbons, because of the construction where it has no wax in that composition, it's what we call a harder ribbon. And what that means is it needs a higher energy setting compared to wax resin and wax. So you might find that you've got multiple different labels at your site. You're using a paper-based label with a wax resin for one requirement, and then you've swapped over to a synthetic label with a resin ribbon, and you're not getting a good print. It's patchy and not the type of quality you want. And that's because they can't use the same settings generally between a resin ribbon and a wax resin ribbon. You will find that you need to adjust the energy settings for this type of ribbon. So, speaking of ribbons and ribbon issues, These are the common ones that I have come across, and the easiest ways to resolve them. So ribbons actually can have quite a few different problems, and it can be very frustrating when you're getting these sorts of issues on site, not understanding why it's happening or how you can fix it. And quite often what I find is if you reach out for help, a lot of providers also aren't aware how ribbons behave, etc. So, it can be quite a niche area. So having some basic understanding of how ribbons work can hugely help you in the long run. So all of these problems, except for the last one, are often heat related. So the good news is that 9 out of 10 problems that you might be receiving with your ribbon can be fixed doing that simple energy setting change that we spoke about before. Now, the ways that we can solve problems, besides from the energy settings that I mentioned, is also through other settings in the driver, which we'll be looking at in just a moment now. But with the energy settings, generally speaking, it's a good rule to always remember that no ribbon is the same. Even if you have a resin ribbon and you've swapped to a different resin ribbon, whilst they're both resins, they're made up of different compositions. So sometimes you will need to make changes if you're changing either the labels or the ribbons that are mixed in there, or even if you change your printer, that can result in needing a different energy range. So this is always the first place that you should start. The next thing to look at is the print speed. So the ribbon requires time to have the ink heated up and transfer to your label. So depending on how fast you're printing, this can affect the quality of the print that you ultimately have. The good news is you can change the print speed in the printing preferences in the same section where we saw the media information, the transmissive, sensor, and thermal transfer as the media type. So on that same section, down the bottom, there's an area about print speed. Have a play around and see if you use a slower speed, if that improves the print, or versus using a higher speed. Sometimes it's a little bit counterintuitive. Often you get a better result generally when you run at a slower speed and a higher sort of energy setting, because that's giving the ribbon the most time to heat and transfer. But sometimes with resins, what I find is that they run better when they're at a higher speed and a lower temperature, because what can happen is it can retransfer back to the liner of the ribbon. So it's just a matter of trial and error. So the other things that can be looked at are the pressure settings. Now remember, I mentioned that platen roller a few slides back. This is where that comes into play. The platen roller is what creates pressure between the ribbon, label, and your print head, or just in the case of direct thermal, the label and the print head. What can happen is when your platen roller starts to wear down, you can get uneven pressure. So you might notice on part of your label it's fading in the same spot every time. No matter what you do, no matter if you change the energy settings or change the print speed, it's still faded in that one spot. And that is almost always related to the platen roller. So as a general rule of thumb, the platen roller should be changed at the same time as when your print head gets changed. They both have the same kilometre rating, so it's important to do that at the same time. The other thing that I often hear is, Kate, the platen roller doesn't look any different. And yes, that might be true. Visually, it might not look different. But the thing is, when you think about how thick a label or how thick a ribbon is, in the case of a ribbon, it's maximum 9.5 microns thick, so it's extremely thin. Even if your platen roller degrades by 1 micron, that is a significant percentage of the pressure between the platen roller, ribbon label, and print head. So this is always a good area to look at if you're getting that fading issue occurring. And the good news is that part is relatively cost effective as well. Okay, so crinkling and creasing was one that I mentioned on the previous slide, and I said that this one is not generally caused by heat. So you normally get creasing or wrinkling in your ribbon occurring because of a rewind tension issue. Most commonly, people assume that it's a production issue, so when the ribbon was actually made that the manufacturer didn't rewind it correctly, And of course, this can happen. There's always mistakes that can occur in production. However, more commonly I find it's either because the ribbon that's being used is too wide compared to the width of the label, or even the opposite, is too narrow compared to the width of the label. This can cause uneven surface tension, and the result of that is that the ribbon starts to dance across the bar, creating these creases, and it ends up making a ridge line. And because there's a ridge starting, it makes the pressure at that point a lot harder than across the rest of the ribbon. So this can cause all sorts of problems. So you should always make sure that you're rewinding onto a cardboard core. Your ribbon should come with a rewind core or cardboard core. If it doesn't, you can reach out to your provider and ask for one. The other thing is to test the ribbon with your media. This is so important. I can't stress it enough. I always recommend that testing is done with ribbons, irrespective of what it is. Your provider should be able to give you a free ribbon sample to test, or they should offer services to test on your behalf. So just simply ask your partner and they'll be able to help you out. And finally, understanding what's available. And what I mean here is, within the 3 different classifications of ribbons, what types of resin ribbons are available? What types of wax resins are available? Is there one that's, better for high-speed printing, or one that's better for blacker printing? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. But asking those questions is how we'll find these answers. So your partner should be able to provide you with technical data sheets or, application brochures, etc., to be able to help you identify the best product for your label. Which brings us to the final section of this webinar, label software and how this can help your business. Now, I often find that companies use programs like Word or Notepad, they're printing direct to the driver, and this is an okay way to print. There's no problem printing in this way. Specifically, when we're looking at label software, though, I do recommend that you should use a label program, even if it's just a light version of a program. And the reason for that is it will help you tremendously when it comes to keeping to consistent printing, trouble-free printing, which is ultimately what we all want. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar about on-file parameter setting. So what this means is if you're using a program like Bartender, which is what I recommend, you can actually save the speed that you want to print at, the energy settings you want to print at. You can even adjust the rewind tension on the spindles in your machine through the driver using Bartender, and it will save that information for that specific file. So if you're having to change your labels over or printing to multiple machines, you can actually have unique settings for different things, and that can save you a lot of time and a lot of hassle. Okay, so we're just about to come to the end of this presentation. I'd like to point you to this website, and if you'd like more information, it's actually got some very useful articles in there. I've mentioned, earlier in this webinar about how to maintain your machine and these kinds of things, so you'll be able to find that information here. Additionally, you'll also find a free download link of Bartender 2019 Lite version. So if you want to see what a good label program looks like, this is a great place to start. It's completely obligation free. So I highly recommend to check that out. Okay, so to wrap it up today, thanks so much for your time. And look, we definitely would love to hear from you. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you want to connect with me personally, check me out, #BarcodeKate on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, our Toshiba Australia page is what you can see on screen here, and I'm sure, would love to also have your feedback on this webinar or any other topics that you might like to hear about. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon. Thank you so much.